Okay, welcome back. This is Critical Reasoning Lecture 4. I want to talk to you today a bit about different kinds of argument. The sort of trajectory is this. We spent last time talking about, in effect, what critical reasoning is not. We were talking about cognitive biases. And those, of course, are things that get in the way of reasoning critically, things that constitute explanations for why you believe a thing, but aren't really genuine reasons for believing a thing. I'm going to come back to that in just a sec. And so I want to turn now to what critical reasoning really is about. What is it? What is it to have a good reason for believing a thing? It's easy to get a little confused about this distinction because of the ambiguity in the notion of why we believe something. If I ask you why you believe something, there's a couple ways you might hear that. You might hear that as, what are the causal forces responsible for producing the belief in me that you're talking about? Or I might hear that as, why do I think it's true, right? What's my reason for believing in this thing that we're talking about? Some years ago, some of you are probably old enough to remember this, John Edwards was running for vice president. I guess it was with John Kerry in 2004, right? I think he was a candidate for vice president. And Edwards was actually opposed to marriage rights being extended to homosexuals. This is a Democrat in 2004, so I guess that shows you how times have changed. But the question was put to him on some TV talk show, rather. The question was, why are you opposed to gay marriage, right? And Edwards' answer was, well, that's just the way I was raised, right? Now, that's an answer of a kind. It's an answer to the question of why I believe it in the first sense. What's causally responsible for my belief being the way it is? Why is it that I have this belief in my head that we ought not to extend marriage rights to gay people, right? But of course, what the interviewer really wanted was an answer to the question of why he thinks it's true that we ought not to extend marriage rights to gays, right? The question is, what's your reason? What's your reason for believing that gays ought not to have the right to get married? And merely talking about your upbringing and what your parents said to you isn't really ever going to count as a reason to believe something, right? It may certainly influence your beliefs. This happens all the time. I still have beliefs knocking around my mind that have little to do with evidence and reason and more to do with my upbringing or even my genetics or something like that. But again, the sort of philosopher's paradigm is, when I believe a thing, it's for reasons. It's because I've got evidence of the truth of the thing that I believe. That's the only real reason to believe something, right? And the mere fact that your parents believed it, or that someone around you believed it, right? This sounds, of course, much like the cognitive biases we were talking about last time. That's because that is basically the phenomenon we're talking about, right? So the sort of thing we're talking about is, I want to have a reason to believe what I believe. And in effect, what this looks like in the case of philosophy is arguments. Okay? The notion of argument is really crucial to this class. We'll see arguments from here on out. And in fact, it really will show up in pretty much any philosophy class you take, right? Because, again, philosophy is almost always about how you get to where you got, right? Oh, you believe that God exists? Why do you believe that, right? And then we sort of give an argument, right? Well, here's a reason for thinking that God exists. Here's a reason for thinking that God does not exist. Here's a reason for thinking that you're both confused. This sort of bandying about of arguments, that's really at the core of philosophy. If you open any modern philosophy journal and turn to an essay, probably it'll start with something like, here's an argument in favor of blah 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 blah. Right? Here's a reason to think we have free will. Here's a reason to think that we don't have free will. Here's an argument to the effect that women ought to be free to choose abortions by law if they wish. Here's an argument to the effect that we ought to make abortion illegal again. Right? The end conclusion is interesting, of course, but the philosophers are going to be concerned about everything that happens on the way to that conclusion. Okay. Now, there's a fundamental distinction that philosophers make between two types of argument. Okay, and the difference comes down to the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Right. So remember, if you haven't read this yet by now, an argument consists of two types of claims. Okay, there are premises or starting assumptions, things that we're going to assume, and then there's the conclusion, the thing that we're reasoning to, the thing that we're trying to give a reason for, right? The thing that we're trying to prove, if you like. And what I'm saying now is that there are two types of arguments because there are two different understandings about what the relationship is supposed to be between the premises that you start with and the conclusion that you reach at the end. And the conclusion is the distinction is all about whether the premises are meant to prove the conclusion beyond all possible doubt or not. Right? That's the distinction. Are the premises that I'm giving here meant to demonstrate the truth of this conclusion beyond all possible doubt, 100%, no doubt, or not? Okay. Now you might think that any argument that doesn't try to do that is going to be inferior to an argument that does try to prove its conclusion 100%. But the truth is really that different contexts and different circumstances call for different kinds of arguments. In philosophy class, in math class, when we're reasoning about definitions of things, well, in those contexts, you do want to try to have certainty between the premises and the conclusion. You do want the conclusion to be a kind of indisputable consequence from the premises with which you begin. When the math instructor says, go prove that the angles of a triangle are equal to 180 degrees, okay, well, the math professor is looking for a strict proof. He's looking for a conclusion, namely that all triangles angles out of 180 degrees. That must be true given your starting assumptions. Right? And so the argument that will count as a good argument here is one whose premises do purport to establish, well, do indeed establish the truth of the conclusion beyond all possible doubt. But the point that I want to make now is that there are lots of other circumstances, lots of other contexts in which we're not looking for that kind of proof at all. Right? So, for example, think about how it often goes in natural science. Right? Here's a sort of fanciful story about a proto-scientist. A proto-scientist, thousands of years ago, does a little survey of the crows living around her, and she observes 100 crows, and she observes of each of those 100 crows that it was black. Okay. Scientific conclusion: all crows are black. Right? Now, probably that's a good argument. Right? In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a crow that wasn't black, and I've seen a lot more than 100. Right? Probably that's a good argument. The fact that I've seen 100 crows, all of which were black, does give me reason to think that all crows are black. Right? And it gives me reason to think that all crows are black, even though there isn't this kind of strict demonstrative proof that all crows are black. Right? The mere fact that I've seen 100 crows and they're all black, well, it doesn't settle the issue beyond all possible doubt. Right? It doesn't sort of prove in a mathematical way that all crows are black. It's certainly possible that there are some crows that aren't black. Okay, but nevertheless, that seems like a perfectly good argument. So, when we're working with arguments that do attempt to establish their conclusions beyond a possible doubt, those arguments are called deductions, right? Or deductive arguments. When we're working with arguments whose premises do not attempt to establish their conclusions beyond a possible doubt, those arguments are called inductions or inductive arguments. Right? So again, deductions, useful for math, for philosophy, for arguments to do with definitions and the like. Inductions, useful for natural science, useful for analogies. Right? A is a lot like B, and A has this feature, so therefore B probably has that feature too. Well, that might be a really good argument, okay? It might be a convincing argument that B probably has this feature. But it's not going to be sort of logically compelling as long as A and B are different at all, right? It's going to depend on the strength of the analogy between A and B, right? And of course, if A and B really are a lot alike, then I've really got probably a good argument here that B probably has this feature, right? But no matter how good it is, it's not going to be a deduction. It's not going to be an example of an argument where I'm trying to demonstrate the conclusion beyond all possible doubt. Appeals to authority are inductive as well, right? We've surveyed 20 chemists, and all 20 chemists say that hydrochloric acid is a potentially dangerous substance, especially in high molarities. Well, that's good reason to think that hydrochloric acid is a potentially dangerous substance, especially in high molarities, right? Even though the testimony of these experts doesn't sort of demonstrate the truth of my conclusion beyond all possible doubt. We reason inductively all the time, right? I mean, we very often in an everyday context, I've got to make a decision about what to believe about something, about where somebody is, or about what I should do next, or whatever. And the evidence on which I'm drawing is not usually going to be so conclusive that I can draw a deductive conclusion with 100% certainty about what I ought to believe or what I ought to do, and so, etc. Right? I'm interested to know whether such and such is a good movie or not. Right? Should I believe that that's a good movie? Well, I want to give myself a reason to believe that it's good or a reason to believe that it's not. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go on Rotten Tomatoes and read the review. I'm going to go look at my favorite movie critic and read what she has to say about it. I'm going to ask my friends about it, watch some previews, right? And maybe it'll be the case that Rotten Tomatoes ranks it very highly, and my favorite critic really likes it, and my friends all say I should go watch it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even if all those things are true, right, it doesn't follow that the movie's good, right? It doesn't follow that I'm going to like it. Not by any sort of logical necessity, right? Maybe all those things could be true, and I just find it to be not a good movie. That's possible, okay? But very often that's what I have to go on, and that's enough, right? And very often those things will be a very good guide to whether I'll find the movie good or not. Okay, so a bit of terminology here. When I'm working with deductions, okay, here's an example of a deduction, just so we're clear. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. Right? Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. Premises, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. Okay. Well, what I'm looking for in a good deduction is that the premises really do guarantee the truth of my conclusion. Right? And what that's going to mean for us is, in effect, that it should be impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time. Right? It better be impossible that my premises are true, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, and at the same time, for the conclusion that Socrates is mortal to be false. Okay, and in this example, clearly we have that feature, right? If the premises are true, then indeed the conclusion must also be true. And when a deduction succeeds in that way, we call it a valid deduction. Right? That's what deductive validity consists in. And notice in particular that validity is really about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. It's not about the premises themselves. So in particular, the premises of a valid argument might be false, right? They don't have to be true. The issue is, well, if they were true, would they prove the truth of the conclusion, right? And so sometimes you're going to engage in a bit of creative thinking. You're going to say, well, okay, I'm going to sort of go to the world where these premises are true. You know, maybe they're not true here, but I'm going to sort of imagine that they are. And wherever that weird place is where these premises are true, must the conclusion also be true there? Right? And if so, then you've got a valid argument. Premise number one, Bill Clinton is a werewolf. Premise number two, werewolves are a kind of rutabaga. Therefore, conclusion, Bill Clinton is some sort of rutabaga. Okay. Those premises are false, right? They are false. They are not true in the actual world. In the actual world, Bill Clinton is a man, and in the actual world, I suppose it's true in the actual world that werewolves aren't a kind of rutabaga, although it's difficult to know what we can say actually about werewolves. But what matters when assessing the validity of this argument is only the following. Well, imagine a world, here's a weird world, okay, but I'm going to tell you what's true in this world. One thing that's true is that Bill Clinton is a werewolf, okay. Another thing that's true is that werewolves are a kind of rutabaga in this world, okay. Difficult to know what the heck else is happening in a world like that. But given only those two things, must it be true that in that world that Bill Clinton is a kind of rutabaga? Yeah, he must be, right? That conclusion really does follow logically from the premises. And because of that relationship between premises and conclusion, that argument is valid, even though its premises are false, okay? Now, of course, that example illustrates that we really want more than just this relationship to obtain between premises and conclusion. We want, that is, not just for our deductions to be valid, we want them also to have true premises. And of course, if we have those two things, valid argument, which means, well, if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be. And also the premises are true, right? Then, of course, the conclusion must also be true. And that's really the sort of gold standard of a deductive argument. And when we've got a valid argument whose premises are also true, we call that argument sound. Okay, so a sound argument is a valid argument that has true premises. There are correlative notions for inductions. Okay, now in the case of inductions, we can't talk meaningfully about validity because the goal isn't to have premises that demonstrate your conclusion beyond all possible doubt, right? The goal is merely to have premises that make the conclusion likely. Okay, so some philosophers will say that premises have to make the conclusion greater than 50% likely or something in order for the argument to count as strong. But you know, I'm not too worried about those details. The point is that the notion in the case of induction is strength, okay, and it'll be a sort of graded notion. Some inductions will be stronger than others, according to the extent to which the premises make the conclusion likely. If the premises make the conclusion very likely, then you'll have a very strong argument. If the premises make the conclusion likely but not very likely, then that's a relatively weak argument, but it may still count as strong, um, you know, as opposed to an argument whose premises don't make the conclusion very likely at all. Um, you know, when you're imagining a court case, right, even in a capital crime case, uh, you're talking about lawyers giving inductive arguments. The prosecutor says, well, the defendant's DNA and fingerprints are all over the murder weapon, and he clearly didn't like the victim, and his alibi sucks, and there are apparent eyewitnesses to the murder. There are people who heard him threaten the life of the victim, and on and on and on and on. Right? You've in effect got a lot of premises here, which could be used in an inductive argument to conclude that the guy is guilty. Okay. Now, again, they're not going to demonstrate his guilt beyond all possible doubt. Is it possible that some aliens came down and, framed the guy for murder and made it look like he'd killed this guy when in fact he didn't, and then the aliens vanished without a trace and nobody ever noticed them? Well, yeah, it's possible. I can imagine it, right? But that just shows you that even in a capital murder case, the point isn't to have evidence that, or premises that prove the conclusion beyond all possible doubt. In that context, the rule is only to have premises that establish your conclusion beyond all reasonable doubt. Okay, and if the jurors have some unreasonable doubts about the guilt of the accused, well, that's fine, right? The doubts having to do with aliens coming down and framing the guy for murder, those are fine. Those shouldn't get in the way of voting for guilty, right? Because the point is that, well, we want to have a high standard. We want to have a high standard for proving somebody guilty, but it's not going to be as high a standard as we require in the case of deductions, right? It's not going to be as high as the standard required for proving that the angles of a triangle all add up to 180 degrees, no matter what the triangle is. Right? In that math context, right? Well, given certain assumptions, certain premises about what we mean by point and line and plane and angle and the like, well, it really is demonstrable beyond all possible doubt that all triangles have 180 degrees. You can try to imagine aliens getting involved and coming down and trying to draw triangles that you've never seen before, but no matter what they draw, if it's a triangle in a nice flat Euclidean space, its angles will add up to 180 degrees, period, right? There's no room for doubt at all, right? But in the inductive case, even in capital murders and so on, there is room for doubt. Might be unreasonable doubt, but there's room for doubt, right? You're not in the business of establishing a conclusion beyond all possible doubt. Okay. So the argument is, the induction is strong to the extent that its premises make the conclusion likely. When you've got an argument that's strong, whose premises are all of them also true? This is the analog of soundness in the case of deductions. Then in the inductive case, when you've got a strong argument whose premises are all true, that argument is called cogent. Okay, so a cogent argument is a strong induction that has true premises. Okay, I think that's enough for now. So I will stop there and see you next time. Thank you.